Kristi Rogers. I'm co-founder and managing partner of Principal to Principal, and I run our Global Supply Chain Task Force, which we kicked off early in the COVID pandemic. So I would say probably April of 2020. The task force really started meeting early in that summer. We came up with some recommendations on how to, in the short term, strengthen supply chains of pharmaceuticals, PPE, and medical equipment, and then longer term, how to make them stronger and more resilient. And some of our recommendations are actually included in current legislation, including the much talked about, at least here in Washington, D.C., the Bipartisan Innovation Act and the massive conference report that is. Well, with us today, we have two sort of founding members of our Global Supply Chain Task Force, and I'll introduce them in just a second. But our phase two, which we're in right now for our task force, is actually focused on semiconductors, their components, other microelectronics, as well as rare earths and critical minerals. And we are up to our eyeballs right now in those conversations. And that's what we'd like to discuss today. Brittany and Greg with us are leading experts on global supply chains in their industries, but also globally. And again, as I've said, they've been with us since the beginning. So I'd like to chat with them a bit about some of their priorities, how their companies are handling it, and how they're seeing some of the challenges. But first, let me set the stage just a little bit. Semiconductors, or chips, are an indispensable technology, as we all know, supporting nearly every aspect of the global supply chain and our security infrastructure, from smartphones to cars to electric vehicles to satellites and nearly every technology in between. But despite their ubiquity, the bulk of chip manufacturing is not done in the United States, nor is it done in our allied nations. More than 70% of industry components for the automotive industry, for defense, for high tech, for medical equipment is actually sourced from China. Some of that is also from Taiwan, as we well know, an allied nation. And we just didn't get here overnight, right? How did we get here? Well, given that we're in a pandemic, I will say that the semiconductor industry just didn't contract COVID. This is decades long in the making of how we got to where we are today, how we pushed our manufacturing base overseas, and why. So this is a long-term solution, but we have short-term challenges as well, and we must start looking at them. The fixes are not easy, but our national security and economic security depend on us finding solutions. So our task force, Greg and Brittany, we like to say that the silver lining of COVID, if there is one, is that it illuminated some of the current systemic weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our global supply chains, particularly before with PPE and now with semiconductors. And there is a window of opportunity for us. With concerted effort and action now, the United States can actually improve our competitive advantage and our economic and national security. But we must come together and have these solutions now. And with that will be my formal introduction of Brittany and Greg. Again, as I said, they are leaders not just in their companies and in their industry, but also globally on the issues of technology, but also the global supply chains. Brittany is HP's global head of government affairs and public policy, and Greg is chief innovation officer and vice president of corporate development at Siemens. So Brittany with HP and Greg from Siemens. Now with that, I would love to turn it over, because I'm sure you both are done listening to me chat, turn it over to the experts for just more of a discussion, but I will throw out a few questions, and I'm going to start with Brittany. So Brittany, HP has exhibited some extraordinary leadership in sort of the global supply chain arena. Your CEO and yourself have been outspoken on some of the challenges, particularly an uncomfortable challenge that many of and most of and manufacturing for our critical goods lies in China. You also have a priority of not just looking at your global supply chains and strengthening them, making them more resilient, but you are also looking at making them more sustainable with a corporate priority on sustainability. Can you just walk us through what that means to you as a leader at HP and what you think that means to HP writ large and for your entire ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kristi. I think that you had a couple of really good points there. And I'll start by saying that I think HP and a lot of other companies across a multitude of different sectors are at an inflection point. I think we were already trending in this direction, but COVID-19 really put the pedal to the metal. And the inflection point is that we're all coming to the realization that our supply chains had some key vulnerabilities in there. Those vulnerabilities may have been a little bit of an afterthought in our business operations, and we looked to build in resiliencies on, secondary sources of supply. But what we found on COVID-19 is that there were really some systemic failures. And the way that HP is looking at this as a business imperative that we can couple with another business imperative, the need for sustainability. We don't look at sustainability just in terms of a social impact that we're going to have, but we look at this as the next point of vulnerability in our supply chains if we don't address it. So talking about how we got to where we are today, HP, like other companies across the sector, have talked about our geographic concentration in China and across Asia. And this geographic concentration wasn't built overnight, and it's not going to be done overnight. Mm-hmm. But what happened is that it started with a couple of micro facilities. And the innovation and the incubation grew from there. And that developed out into an ecosystem that has benefited from geographic proximity that enables us to move quickly on adapting to customer needs. But what it's done is it's created a little bit of an Achilles heel, where when you have a disruption in that one region, it's hard to respond quickly and it's hard to meet the needs of a global customer base. So HP is taking this opportunity right now, and we're looking at our supply chains and how we can curate it going forward, being more deliberate, including more considerations. I think historically, cost has been a number one driver for how supply chains are curated. And now we're realizing that cost is one of a multitude of considerations, including sustainability, including resiliency, including efficiency, customer demands, and also national security. We have to look at national security and economic security as part of those considerations as well. I'm glad, like you mentioned, the kind of silver lining out of COVID-19 that, this kind of policy imperative is getting the due diligence that it deserves. I think that now we're at a sense of urgency. We need long-term solutions, but we also need short-term solutions as well. So I feel empowered to have these types of conversations to help policymakers and others understand that this is not something that's going to go away overnight, that we need to, educate ourselves. We need to leverage our innovation, but probably most importantly, we need to do this in concert with industry, who's going to be the practitioners of these supply chains.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Brittany. And I'm going to go back to both of you. So this is just a heads up and ask what you would ask and hope that the policymakers can focus on now to actually move some of this forward. Because yes, we need leadership from industry, which HP and Siemens are exhibiting, with a recognition of national security and economic security as factors. But we also need the policymakers, both Republicans and Democrats, to come together on some of these issues that should not be partisan, right? Yeah. So with that, Greg, I'm going to ask you a question. So both companies are leaders clearly in technology and innovation. As Chief Innovation Officer at Siemens, you've seen a lot of this, right? I mean, from advanced manufacturing, whether it's 3D printing or more broadly additive manufacturing or digital twin technology. But as we look at international supply chains and global supply chains, how do you think and how would you recommend we can look at or use digitization and technology to improve supply chain resiliency and the visibility of our supply chains?
Kristi, that's a really great question. And I can tell you that, here at Siemens and, with our partners like HP and our great relationship that we've had with the P2P supply chain task force, we've learned a lot about how global supply chains are impacted by gaps that are unforeseen. And one of the great things that we're seeing now is the ability to use digital technology to not only monitor supply chains, but also be able to see gaps and then counteract them before they become major problems. What we see is that our ability today to use digital manufacturing techniques can speed the production, can make more efficient the production, can have more visibility in the production of whatever product, critical good, need that a particular nation or customer has. But what we haven't seen, and one of the key areas we're looking at right now and working hard to, is to take that advancement in manufacturing and visibility in manufacturing and turn that into a way to shorten the supply chain. In essence, we have right now is an extraordinarily capable manufacturing system around the world using digital tools, but you have a legacy supply chain. So no matter whether you're building the most high-tech, innovative product in the world, you're doing it and then shipping it with legacy means. Here at Siemens, we want to be able to help our customers be one day from their customers. And that means they have to be able to transmit and move digital files, digital recipes, for lack of a better term, digital twins, digital threads around the world towards a more dispersed manufacturing system. And so one of the key things that we've seen from the P2P task force is a recommendation that there be a digital twin stockpile, for example, be a digital capable system where we can push critical goods and supplies to the point of need and have them manufactured there, not just shipped there. That will allow for the folks around the world that need these critical items to have them and be just one day away from having their needs satisfied, whether it's with the pandemic or whether it's just with the fact that you've got a shortage in a particular product. We do a lot right now in the second phase of the task force focused on, for example, semiconductors, one of the most ubiquitous and most critical items in virtually every major manufactured end item that people buy today. And we're finding that that shortage drastically impacts everything from automotive to aeronautics to even, washing machines. You name it, there is a chip in it. The ability to push the way of making a chip or the recipe to create a printed circuit board to a location closer to the point of need would then help alleviate some of those backlogs in supply chain. Have manufacturers dispersed around the world where they can have and receive these recipes, these digital twins, and then build them and then ship them. What it also does, and it goes back to Brittany's great point about sustainability, by shrinking these supply chains, it allows us to have a less robust carbon footprint, and in some ways even eliminate it. Siemens' goal isn't 2050 to eliminate and go to net zero, it's 2030. So not only are we trying to drive the change that we see necessary around the world, we're also living it. And so as we look at this, I see and we see the power of digital technology, not only transforming how we manufacture, how we get goods and services to individual customers, but also how we take care of our planet. And that's where we think the next generation will be.
Yeah, wow. And we could continue this conversation all day. I mean, some great points from both of you, which is why we're having this conversation today, because you both fully understand the challenges, and you are both, with your companies, Siemens and HP, leaders in the innovation, with a recognition of the need to be more environmentally responsible and for sustainability. And I think the interesting thing is when we're talking about making our supply chains more resilient, and when we're adding, maybe we should reshore some of our manufacturing so it's closer. Maybe we should ally shore to allied nations. One of the conversations that we've all had with our task force that I'd like to share with everyone is lots of times when you're thinking of that, either reshoring it or ally shoring it, our environmental standards are so much higher and greater than those in other nations that are not allied nations or in the United States. And so thereby, sort of by ally shoring or reshoring our manufacturing, we can actually improve greatly sort of their environmental footprint. Sorry, that was a long way of saying it. And you hit on, both of you, some of the technology pieces that I think are so critical. I actually would love, and this is one of our recommendations, I'm not going to recommend both of you, but I would love for each of you to spend a day, maybe a year, inside the federal government to modernize them, to bring some of these concepts to them. I'm joking, but really seriously only half joking, because one of our recommendations, which we just briefed the congressional leadership staff today, is that the government should look at, the executive branch should look at, Commerce Department should look at an exchange program with business executives to bring them in to modernize the government, to look at some of these capabilities, whether it's the mapping capability, the digital twin capability, the added manufacturing, and figure out how we can improve government. So with that being said, that's one of our recommendations. Brittany, back over to you. 2 questions, and then Greg, you'll get the second half of this question. First, anything you want to sort of comment on, because I know HP is also a leader in sort of 3D printing and additive manufacturing more broadly. So that being one, anything you want to comment on that Greg had said? And then also, is there something that you would like to impress upon if, let's say, the government officials are watching, decision makers are watching, with their current discussions on the Hill and trying to figure out how to pass the CHIPS Act and making supply chains more resilient? So Brittany, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So I will number one, validate everything that Greg said. I couldn't have said it better myself. I think one of the things that he talked about was the modernization of how we view our supply chains, in particularly the disbursement. I think that these geographic concentrations that I spoke to before, we can all acknowledge that that's a problem, because it creates dependencies that are vulnerable to any given win, whether it's natural disasters or geopolitics. And so we can all get behind disbursement, but the disbursement has to be cost effective, and it still has to be efficient. And to Greg's point, it has to meet the needs of our customers. So I think that disbursement is going to be a key tool. Picking up on where he said about digital twins, that's really about leveraging new innovations and emerging technologies to making sure that we can increase capacity and capabilities on a quick turnaround. And HP is looking at this space very deliberately right now. You mentioned additive manufacturing. We're looking to take the lead there. We're looking at 3D printing as ways that we can help either ourselves with our manufacturing or other companies and customers be able to modify, upskill, or retool their manufacturing to meet needs quickly, very quickly. So I echo everything that Greg said. To your second question, Kristi, if I could tell policymakers that are listening one thing, I would say this is not a partisan issue. This is not a partisan issue. And when I talk to policymakers across the political spectrum, we all are working to get to the same place. Mm-hmm. We may have different visions or ideas how to get there, but we should all keep in mind that we're working to get to the same place. And that same place is that we have a functioning private sector that is able to meet critical demands of consumers, particularly in defense, healthcare, technology, otherwise, in a way that empowers our national security and protects our economic security at the same time. So what this looks like us having regionalized and diverse supply chains with built-in redundancy. This looks like us taking into consideration the latest innovations and emerging technologies that are on the forefront. This also looks like us using practices that are sustainable. So whether sustainability looks like environmentally friendly, protecting human rights, or otherwise, we're looking for practices and supply chains that are curated in ways that we can sustain for generations to come.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Greg, I'm going to tweak my question a little bit based on things I've heard you say before, and also some of our discussions with key policymakers on Capitol Hill. And that's going to one of our recommendations where we call for a supply chain institute inside the Department of Commerce, or as it's currently phrased, a supply chain resiliency program. Mm-hmm. And there's some great concern that we're just calling for adding another bureaucracy. If people knew me personally, they would know that I'm not calling for another layer of bureaucracy inside our federal government. However, I do think this is an element of modernizing the federal government, helping them to come into the 21st century where they are in a position to do things that industry can't. And one of the things that we call for is mapping the global supply chains, particularly of critical goods. So we can identify vulnerabilities and see what's coming up and then work with industry to try to alleviate those choke points. So Greg, I know you've had some comments on this, on trusted traceability and a few others. Could you just explain why, from your standpoint as an expert in this, that this is important?
Absolutely, and it is absolutely essential. You're completely right, and as Brittany talked about the impact and the need for vulnerable supply chains to be recognized and fixed, you got to know what's there. And in order to do that, you need, and we've talked about this before, you need to approach national preparedness like we approached national defense. And to do that, you need to have visibility of both the adversary, but also yourself. You need to understand where your critical goods are. You need to understand the amount that you have, and you need to be able to project. You can't predict, but project how much you might need in the future. And you can't do that without having a clear understanding, a clear visibility of what's in those supply chains and where there may be bottlenecks. I think also we need to we talk a lot about this whole of government approach. What we need for this is a whole of nation approach. Because today, for example, I'm sitting in Ohio, working with the local government here to help reshore and localize, industry into the United States for key components that we need. That's hugely important, but it's not at the federal level, it's at the state level. You need that whole of nation approach where you not only have the federal team at the Commerce Department looking across international boundaries, looking across the states, looking across the different industries to determine where the supply chains are, but also we need to empower and incentivize state and local leaders to support this effort. Because what might be of critical importance in a supply chain in Texas may be entirely different for the folks in Ohio. And so we need to make sure that we bring this whole of nation approach, and you can't do that without the leadership of the federal government. The federal government needs to be able to bring everybody together, industry, government, academia, and say, look, this is where we need to be. This is our end state. And instead of the government telling us how to get there, ask us how we can help them get there. And that's the key to what the Institute would do. It's not going to be prescriptive as we've outlined it. It's going to be open to new ideas. It's going to be open to a way in which different regions, different allies, different industries can help support the common goal of knowing where and when we need things in our supply chain and being able to counteract them. We can't be reactive anymore. We're not very good at predicting. Nobody really is at the speed at which threats and changes are coming and facing our nation. We have to be prepared. And to do that, we have to treat it just like we would national defense, where at the top, we have a strong, powerful, integrated plan and team leading our way to ensure that we are ready for the next challenge, whatever it might be.
If I could add in there quickly, Kristi, I have to add in there because, Greg, you said it so well. And I'll also add that I think that it should be a foreign policy imperative also. We have to understand where our inputs are coming from, particularly our inputs that are critical to our national security or economic security, so we can understand where we may have a potential vulnerability. It should be a foreign policy imperative because those vulnerabilities could very well come in the form of geopolitical disruptions. We're seeing this right now with what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. I'll also add there that having this knowledge, the supply chain mapping and understanding equips us for that response in a way that right now we're on our back foot. So, for example, if we see a natural disaster hit an area where there's a strong geographic concentration of a critical mineral, we'll know that that's upon us. And we can then leverage what Greg and I talked about on some of our key innovations to try to increase capacity someplace else, whether it's domestically or in an allied nation or nearshored or elsewhere. But we need to have that understanding in order to be prepared to do that.
Absolutely.
Completely agree. And when I said it is the solutions to these challenges are national and economic security imperatives, you both articulated and expounded on that beautifully. So thank you for that. It's not just a talking point, right? I mean, and it's not because it is a national and economic security imperative. It's not partisan, nor should it be. So with that, I think I will close it by saying to both of you, thank you so much for having the leadership and the commitment, both individually, personally, but also from your companies, to have a seat at this table and to lead the discussion. Because as you've all heard me say, the private sector has to lead on this, but the federal government and the local and state governments, as Greg pointed out, need to act on it. And they do need to act on it because it's not just a national security imperative nor an economic imperative. It's for us to remain competitive. We need to address these solutions. We are uncompetitive across the board. And that's why manufacturing has moved overseas. So now it's all of us together sitting at the table. And if anybody wants to join the merry band of the Principal to Principal Global Supply Chain Task Force, please reach out. We are having regular conversations with the executive branch and Congress, as well as Brittany pointed out, the European Union and governments in the ASEAN and our friends in Australia and the Five Eyes. So because it is a whole of nation and a whole of allied nation effort. So thank you both for sharing your expertise and explaining some very complicated components so simply and beautifully. So thanks, Brittany. Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Kristi.
Thank you.